What happens when a simple act of love for a grandchild is twisted into a public nightmare? For Arthur and Eleanor Williams, a retired couple with spotless reputations, a trip to buy a birthday present turned into a scene of humiliation and false accusations. They were profiled, accused, and cuffed by police officers blinded by prejudice. The officers thought they had an easy target in the two elderly black grandparents. They had no idea who was about to pull into that parking lot. They had no idea they were about to confront the unyielding wrath of a United States Marine captain coming home to defend his own. The autumn air in Oak Creek, a manicured suburb just north of the city, had a familiar crispness to it. It was the kind of air that made Arthur Williams feel nostalgic. At 74, with a tweed jacket that had seen more seasons than most of the town's oak trees, he felt a deep, quiet contentment. Beside him in their polished 2018 Buick LaCrosse, his wife of 51 years, Eleanor, hummed a soft gospel tune. Her silver-streaked hair was elegantly pinned, and her eyes, though framed by the fine lines of a life well lived, held a vibrant, youthful sparkle. They were on a special mission. Their grandson, Leo, was turning 12, and Leo was obsessed with filmmaking. He created little movies with his friends on an old smartphone, complete with surprisingly clever camera angles and dramatic, if slightly wobbly, action sequences. Arthur and Eleanor had saved for months. They were going to Quantum Electronics, a large, sleek store with glass walls and an intimidatingly modern logo, to buy him his first real camera, a Canon EOS R100. They had researched it meticulously, comparing specs and reading reviews. It was more than a gift. It was an investment in a dream. "Are you sure this is the place, Artie?" Eleanor asked, peering at the massive storefront. "It looks so expensive." Arthur chuckled, his voice a warm, gentle rumble. "It is expensive, Elle. That's why we've been putting money in the Leo's Future Director Fund jar for 6 months. The boy has a gift. We need to nurture it." They found a parking spot near the entrance and walked hand in hand into the store. The inside was bright white and cool, with rows of gadgets displayed like museum artifacts. Cheerful pop music played softly overhead. For a Tuesday afternoon, it was relatively quiet. A few younger customers were engrossed by a display of drones, and a man in a business suit was speaking animatedly to a sales associate about smart home systems. They spent nearly an hour with a helpful young employee named Ben, who patiently explained the camera's features, showed them different lenses, and never once made them feel out of place or rushed. Arthur paid with his debit card, the total coming to just over $650. Ben carefully packed the camera, the extra battery they'd purchased, and a memory card into a glossy black bag with the store's silver logo. "Your grandson is a lucky kid," Ben said with a genuine smile. "This is a fantastic starter camera." "Thank you, young man. You've been a great help," Eleanor said, her voice full of warmth. As they left the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind them, they felt a swell of pride and excitement. They couldn't wait to see the look on Leo's face. They were so caught up in their happy bubble that they didn't notice the store manager, a woman with a severe blonde bob and a pinched expression, watching them leave. She picked up the phone behind her counter, her eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. They had just reached their car, Arthur fumbling for the keys in his jacket pocket, when the serene afternoon was shattered. 2 Oak Creek Police Department cruisers, a Ford Explorer and a Dodge Charger, screeched into the parking lot. Lights flashing and boxed their Buick in. 2 officers emerged. The first, a man in his late 20s with a military-style haircut and a cocky swagger, was Officer Chad Miller. The second, his superior, was Sergeant Frank Davis, a burly, mustachioed man in his 50s whose face seemed set in a permanent look of weary cynicism. Officer Miller approached them, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered Glock. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and place your hands where I can see them." Arthur and Eleanor froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The glossy bag containing their grandson's dream gift suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Confusion, quickly followed by a cold, creeping dread, washed over them. This had to be a mistake, a terrible, unbelievable mistake. "Officer, there must be some sort of misunderstanding," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He held his empty palms up, a gesture of peace and compliance he'd unfortunately had to learn as a young black man decades ago. Eleanor stood beside him, her face a mask of disbelief. "We haven't done anything wrong." Officer Miller's eyes flickered over them, a dismissive, sizing-up glance that lingered on Arthur's tweed jacket and Eleanor's simple purse. It was a look they both knew all too well. It was the look that dismissed their history, their character, their very humanity, and saw only a stereotype. "We received a call from the store manager about a theft," Miller said, his tone flat and accusatory. He gestured with his chin toward the quantum electronics bag in Arthur's hand. "A high-value camera, to be exact. Matches the description of the one you're holding." Sergeant Davis stood back, arms crossed, observing. He didn't intervene. His silence was its own form of confirmation, a tacit approval of Miller's aggressive approach. "A theft?" Arthur's voice rose slightly. "Officer, we just purchased this camera. I have the receipt right here in my wallet." He made a slow, deliberate move toward his back pocket. "Hold it!" Miller snapped, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Don't you move. Just stay right where you are." The command was so sharp, so filled with unwarranted hostility, that it felt like a physical blow. People were starting to notice. A woman loading groceries into her minivan slowed to stare. A couple walking toward the store paused, their curiosity piqued by the flashing lights. Arthur and Eleanor were suddenly on display, the subjects of a public spectacle. The warmth of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of shame. "Chad, let the man get his wallet," Sergeant Davis grunted, his voice gravelly. It wasn't an order given out of decency, but one of procedural necessity. Miller smirked. "All right, old-timer, real slow." With trembling fingers, Arthur retrieved his worn leather wallet. He carefully extracted the long, crisp receipt from quantum electronics and held it out. Miller snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it for barely a second before scoffing. This could be for anything, a different item, or it could be fake. Easy enough to print something up these days. "A fake receipt?" Eleanor's voice was incredulous. "Sir, we are retired school teachers. I was a librarian for 40 years. My husband taught history. We have never stolen a single thing in our entire lives." Her plea for reason, for them to see who they truly were, was met with a wall of indifference. Yeah, everyone's a saint when we show up," Miller sneered. He turned to Arthur. "What's in the bag?" "It's the camera we just bought for our grandson's birthday," Arthur said, his dignity a fragile shield against the officer's contempt. "Open it," Miller commanded. Arthur placed the bag on the hood of his car and carefully took out the box containing the Canon EOS R100. Miller examined it, then looked at the receipt again. He pointed to a line item. "Says here you bought an extra battery. Where's that?" "It's in the box with the charger," Arthur stammered, his mind struggling to keep up with the absurdity of the situation. "So you say." Miller then looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to look in your purse." "My purse?" Eleanor clutched it tighter. "Why?" "Standard procedure. Looking for other stolen merchandise," Miller said. It was not standard procedure, and they all knew it. It was an exercise in power, in degradation. Without waiting for permission, Miller reached out and took the purse from her. He unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the hood of the car. A wallet, a tube of lipstick, a small Bible, a packet of tissues, reading glasses. A small framed photo of their son Marcus, in his Marine Corps dress blues, clattered onto the metal. Miller picked up the photo, glanced at it, and tossed it back down with the rest of the items, his face impassive. The casual disrespect for the image of their son, a man who had served his country for over 15 years, was a fresh, deep cut. It was then that the store manager, Karen Vickers, walked out, flanked by a nervous-looking security guard. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at them. "That's them," she said, her voice loud and self-righteous. "They were acting very suspicious. They lingered in the camera section for a long time, and I saw him slip something into her purse when they thought no one was looking." It was a blatant, venomous lie. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at this woman, a complete stranger, who was casually and cruelly dismantling their lives on the asphalt of a parking lot. Ma'am, that is not true, Aunt, Arthur said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. We spoke to a young man named Ben. He helped us. Look at your own security cameras. Our cameras in that section have been glitching all day, Karen said smoothly, a lie she had clearly prepared. But my eyes work just fine. That was all Miller needed. All right, that's enough, he declared, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for suspicion of felony theft. Arrest! Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. You can't be serious. Put your hands behind your back, sir, Miller ordered Arthur. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Arthur's thin wrists. The click of the cuffs locking echoed in the stunned silence. At 74 years old, Arthur Williams, a man who had mentored hundreds of students and served as a deacon in his church for 30 years, was being treated like a common criminal. Miller then moved to Eleanor. Ma'am. No, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please don't do this. Sergeant Davis, who had been a silent observer, finally stepped forward. He took the cuffs from Miller. I'll handle this, Chad. His touch was marginally gentler as he cuffed Eleanor, but the result was the same. The degradation was absolute. As they were led, stooped, and shamed toward the back of Miller's cruiser, Arthur saw the faces of the onlookers. He saw pity in some, morbid curiosity in others, and in a few he saw a flicker of confirmation. The ugly, prejudiced belief that this was just how things were. The weight of that injustice was heavier than any handcuffs. He and his beloved Eleanor were being erased, replaced by a caricature drawn by bigotry. As the car door slammed shut, plunging them into the cramped, plastic-molded back seat, a profound sense of hopelessness began to set in. Captain Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps, drove his gray Ford F-150 with the quiet focus of a man accustomed to far more stressful situations. He was on a 72-hour leave from Camp Lejeune, a surprise visit for his father's upcoming birthday. He hadn't told his parents he was coming. He pictured their faces, the shock turning to unadulterated joy. He'd call them when he was a few minutes away, tell them to look out their front window. He smiled at the thought. After 2 tours in Afghanistan and his recent promotion to captain, little in life felt as good as seeing his mom and dad. They were his bedrock, the source of his moral compass. They had taught him integrity, discipline, and the quiet strength of dignity, values the Marine Corps had only sharpened. He was just turning onto the main road that led to his parents' neighborhood when he saw it. Up ahead in the sprawling parking lot of the Quantum Electronics store were the unmistakable flashing blue and red lights of 2 Oak Creek police cruisers. That wasn't unusual. What made his heart slam against his ribs was the car they had boxed in, a pristine, cream-colored 2018 Buick LaCrosse. His parents' car. His blood ran cold. He slowed his truck, his eyes scanning the scene, his training kicking in, assessing every detail with rapid precision. He saw 2 officers. He saw a blonde woman talking with one of them. And then he saw it. The back door of one of the cruisers was open, and a stooped figure, a man in a familiar tweed jacket, was being pushed inside, his father. Then he saw his mother, her shoulders slumped in a way he'd never seen before, being led to the same car. A feeling Marcus hadn't felt since a firefight in Helmand Province seized him. A cold, razor-sharp rage that narrowed the world down to a single objective: protect his family. He didn't speed. He didn't swerve. He pulled his truck into the adjacent parking aisle, turned the engine off, and got out. He moved with an economy of motion that was both unnervingly calm and intensely menacing. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple gray Henley, but he carried himself with an authority that no uniform could bestow. As he approached, Officer Miller was just closing the door on his parents. He was laughing about something with the store manager, Karen. "Excuse me," Marcus's voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it had a quality of command that made everyone freeze. Miller turned, his smile fading into a look of annoyance. "Sir, this is an active police scene. You need to stay back." Marcus ignored him. His eyes were locked on the tinted window of the police cruiser, where he could just make out the silhouettes of his parents' heads. "Those are my parents in your car," Marcus stated. It wasn't a question. "What is going on?" "This is official police business, pal. Move along before I arrest you for obstruction, Miller said, puffing out his chest. He was used to intimidating people. He was not prepared for Marcus Williams. Marcus took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He was taller than Miller, and his physical presence was formidable. "You're not listening," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You have detained Arthur and Eleanor Williams. I am their son. You will tell me what crime they have been charged with, now." Sergeant Davis, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, stepped in. The younger officer was out of his depth. "Sir, your parents are under arrest on suspicion of felony theft." Marcus's gaze shifted to Davis. He assessed the older cop in a second, complacent, lazy, letting his hothead partner run the show. "On what evidence?" Marcus demanded. "The store manager witnessed them shoplifting a high-value camera," Davis said, gesturing toward Karen. Marcus's eyes fell on Karen Vickers, who shrank back slightly under his intense scrutiny. Then he looked at the open bag from Quantum Electronics sitting on the hood of his parents' Buick, next to the scattered contents of his mother's purse. He saw his own face staring up at him from the discarded photo frame. A fresh wave of fury, cold and pure, washed over him. He fought it down. Emotion was a liability. He needed to be methodical. "They purchased that camera," Marcus said. "My father would have a receipt." "The receipt he produced could be fraudulent," Miller interjected, trying to regain control. "And the witness statement is enough for probable cause." "So a woman who works on commission," Marcus began, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at Karen, "makes a baseless accusation against two elderly black patrons. You ignore their receipt. You don't verify with the cashier who sold it to them. You don't review the store's security footage. Instead, you immediately cuff two senior citizens in a public parking lot based on a single, unsubstantiated claim. Is that a correct summary of your police work, Sergeant?" Davis's face reddened slightly. Phrased like that, it sounded bad. "We are conducting an ongoing investigation." "No," Marcus said, his voice like flint. "You're done conducting it. Your investigation is over. You're now going to conduct a new one, with me. First, you're going to call your supervisor and have him meet us here. Second, you are going to get the security footage from this store for the last hour. All of it, not just from the glitching camera section. And third," he took another step closer, his eyes boring into Miller's, "you are going to take my parents out of that car, uncuff them, and let them sit in their own vehicle while we sort out the mess you've made." Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You don't get to give us orders, buddy." Marcus stood still for a moment. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't show a driver's license. He flipped it open to his military ID. "Captain Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I've commanded 200 Marines in combat zones. I know what a chain of command looks like. I know what proper procedure is. And I know a civil rights violation when I see one. You have 2 minutes to get my parents out of that car before my next call is to the ACLU and the best civil rights attorney on the East Coast. Your choice, Sergeant." Sergeant Davis looked from the ID card to Marcus's unflinching eyes. He saw no bluff. He saw a man who would burn their entire world to the ground to protect his family. The sweat on Davis's brow suddenly felt very cold. This situation had just spun violently out of his control. The dynamic in the parking lot had shifted as if a switch had been thrown. The smug confidence of Officer Miller evaporated, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. Sergeant Davis, a man who had coasted through the last decade of his career by avoiding paperwork and conflict, was now faced with a mountain of both. Karen Vickers, the store manager, looked pale and nervous, her fabricated story beginning to feel like a very flimsy shield. Davis made the call. He spoke in low, clipped tones to his shift commander, Lieutenant Allen. He tried to frame it as a simple misunderstanding that was being handled, but Marcus, standing just a few feet away, could hear the tremor of anxiety in his voice. While Davis was on the phone, Marcus turned his attention back to Miller. "The keys," he said, holding out his hand. "Give me the keys to their cuffs." Miller hesitated, looking toward his sergeant for guidance. Davis, still on the phone, gave a short, sharp nod. With ill grace, Miller handed them over. Marcus walked to the cruiser and opened the back door. The relief that washed over Arthur and Eleanor's faces was so profound, it was heartbreaking. "Marcus," Eleanor whispered, tears starting anew, but this time from relief. "I don't understand." "You don't have to, Mom," Marcus said softly, his voice gentle for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm here now. I'll handle it." He expertly unlocked their cuffs. The red, angry marks on their thin wrists sent another spike of rage through him, but he kept his expression calm for their sake. He helped them out of the car, his hands steady and supportive on their elbows. He walked them to their own Buick, opened the doors for them, and made sure they were seated comfortably before closing the doors, giving them a space of privacy and dignity away from the prying eyes of the officers and the growing number of onlookers. He then retrieved his mother's belongings from the hood of the car, carefully placing everything back in her purse, lingering for a moment on the photo of himself before tucking it safely inside. By the time Lieutenant Allen arrived, a weary-looking man with salt and pepper hair, the scene was set. Marcus met him halfway. He gave a brief, factual, and damning account of what he had witnessed and what his parents had told him. He omitted no detail: the dismissal of the receipt, the lie about the glitching cameras, the public humiliation, the refusal to investigate before arresting. "Lieutenant," Marcus concluded, his tone respectful but firm, "my father is a retired history teacher. My mother was a librarian. They have lived in this county for 51 years and have never even had a speeding ticket. The actions of your officers today were not just unprofessional, they were a clear-cut case of racial profiling resulting in false arrest." Lieutenant Allen listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. He looked at Miller, then at Davis, then at the visibly shaken store manager. "Sergeant, get the store's security footage. Now," Allen ordered. "And not just from the manager. I want to speak to your corporate loss prevention. Get them on the phone." Karen Vickers began to stammer. "Well, like I said, the cameras in that section—" "I don't care about that section," Allen cut her off, his patience clearly gone. "I want footage from the front entrance, the checkout counters, and the main floor. I want to see every second from when Mr. and Mrs. Williams entered this store until they left." He turned to a third officer who had arrived with him. "Go inside with her. Make sure we get what we asked for." While they waited, Marcus walked over to the young sales associate, Ben, who had been watching the entire drama unfold from a distance, looking horrified. "You're Ben?" Marcus asked. Yes, sir," the young man stammered. "You sold my parents a camera about an hour ago?" "Yes, a Canon EOS R100 and an extra battery and a memory card. They were so nice. They told me all about their grandson, Leo," Ben said, speaking in a rush. "I rang them up myself. I saw him pay with his card. I don't understand why this is happening." "Would you be willing to state that to the lieutenant?" Marcus asked. "Absolutely," Ben said without hesitation. Marcus led him over to Lieutenant Allen, and Ben gave his clear, unwavering account, which directly contradicted the manager's story. The foundation of the accusation was now crumbling into dust. 40 minutes later, the officer returned from the store's security office with a tablet. Lieutenant Allen, Sergeant Davis, Officer Miller, and Marcus huddled around it. Karen Vickers was kept at a distance, looking increasingly ill. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Arthur and Eleanor entering the store. It showed them speaking with Ben for nearly an hour, examining the camera with genuine interest. It showed them walking to the checkout, Ben ringing them up, and Arthur paying with his debit card. It showed Ben handing them the bag. At no point did either of them slip anything into a pocket or a purse. They behaved exactly as any honest customer would. "Keep playing it," Marcus said, his voice cold. They fast-forwarded. The footage from another angle, high on the wall, showed the entire camera section. A few minutes after Arthur and Eleanor began talking to Ben, another man entered the aisle. He was a young white man in a gray hoodie and baggy jeans. He moved quickly, glancing around nervously. He picked up an identical Canon camera box, looked directly at it, and then with swift, practiced ease, shoved the entire box under his hoodie and walked briskly out of the aisle and toward a side exit. The timeline was damning. The actual theft had occurred while Arthur and Eleanor were in plain sight, engaged in a legitimate transaction. But the most incriminating part was yet to come. The camera focused on the main counter showed Karen Vickers. She was looking at a monitor, and the footage showed her watching the man in the hoodie. She saw him. She saw him take the camera. She did nothing. Her eyes then darted over to the elderly black couple laughing with the sales associate. She watched them, her expression hardening. After the man in the hoodie was long gone, she watched Arthur and Eleanor leave the store. Only then, after the real thief had vanished, did she pick up the phone to call the police. She had seen the real crime and ignored it, choosing instead to pin it on the Williamses. The silence that followed the video was deafening. Officer Miller's face was ashen. Sergeant Davis refused to meet anyone's eyes, staring at the ground as if it held the answers to his ruined career. Lieutenant Allen took a deep breath. He turned to Marcus. "Captain Williams, on behalf of the Oak Creek Police Department, Marcus held up a hand. "Don't," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't apologize to me. You're going to apologize to my parents, and then we're going to talk about what happens next. Because this is not over. Not by a long shot." The revelation from the security footage hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The narrative so confidently constructed by Karen Vickers and Officer Miller had not just been disproven. It had been obliterated, exposing a raw, ugly foundation of prejudice and deceit. Lieutenant Allen, to his credit, acted swiftly. His first move was to walk directly over to the Williamses' Buick. Marcus followed, standing back to give him space. The lieutenant addressed Arthur and Eleanor through the open passenger window, his voice laced with a deep professional shame. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," he began, his hat in his hands. "My name is Lieutenant Allen. There are no words to properly express how sorry I am for what my officers have put you through today. Your innocence is completely and totally verified. The actions taken here were inexcusable and are not representative of this department's standards. You are, of course, free to go. We will handle everything from here." Eleanor simply nodded, her expression exhausted but resolute. Arthur looked past the lieutenant to his son, a look of immense pride and gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Arthur said, his voice heavy with the emotion of the last few hours. "We just want to go home." As Marcus helped his parents get ready to leave, Lieutenant Allen turned his attention to his subordinates and the store manager. His face was a thundercloud. "Davis, Miller, my office, now. You're both on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your badges and service weapons." The order was barked, leaving no room for argument. Sergeant Davis, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in an hour, complied silently. Officer Miller, however, still had a flicker of belligerent defiance. "Sir, we were acting on the witness's information," he started. "You're on leave, Miller, which means you're to remain silent," Allen snapped, cutting him off. "Internal Affairs will be in touch." He then turned his steely gaze on Karen Vickers, who was now being questioned by another officer. "As for you, ma'am, you just filed a false police report, and based on this evidence, it seems you did so with malicious intent. You might want to find a lawyer." Karen's face crumpled. The self-righteous manager was gone, replaced by a frightened woman who had just realized the catastrophic consequences of her actions. But Marcus wasn't finished. As his parents started their car, he approached Lieutenant Allen one last time. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low so only Allen could hear. "Administrative leave isn't enough. I want their body camera footage." Allen blinked. "Captain, the store footage was conclusive." "The store footage shows what happened. The body cam footage will show why," Marcus insisted. "It will show their intent. It will record every word they said to my parents, every word they said to each other when they thought no one was listening. It will be the difference between a firing and a criminal conviction for civil rights violations. I'm requesting it formally right now, and I'll be following up with a Freedom of Information Act request tomorrow morning." Lieutenant Allen stared at Marcus, seeing the unbending steel in his eyes. He knew this Marine captain would not let this go. He was going to see it through to the end, no matter what. "I'll have it pulled," Allen conceded with a sigh. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. The Williams family retained the services of a top civil rights attorney, a man Marcus had been given the name of by a contact in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. The local news got wind of the story, and it exploded. "Decorated Marine Captain intervenes as local police falsely arrest elderly parents" was the headline that flashed across the state. The body camera footage was the final devastating nail in the coffin for Miller and Davis. As Marcus and their lawyer watched it in a sterile office, the audio painted an even more sickening picture than the security video. It began in Miller's car as they were driving to the scene. "Another call from Quantum," Miller's voice said with a sigh. "Manager Karen says she's got a couple of suspicious ones hanging around the high-end cameras." "Let me guess the description," Davis's voice responded, thick with cynicism. "You got it in one, Frank," Miller chuckled. "Bet you $1 they drive something old and flashy." The footage showed their arrival, their immediate aggressive stance. But the most damning audio came after they had cuffed Arthur and Eleanor and placed them in the car. Miller had muted his microphone, a violation of department policy, but had failed to do it correctly. His conversation with Davis was still faintly but clearly audible. "Piece of cake," Miller was saying. "Old-timers like that, they're either genuinely senile and forget they took it, or they think they can get away with it. We'll get a quick confession at the station. Easy collar." "You see the way he looked at me?" Miller continued, referring to Arthur. "Trying to pull that dignified old man routine. They always do." There was no talk of evidence, no concern for procedure, just a smug, prejudiced assumption of guilt based on nothing more than the color of their skin and their age. They had decided the Williamses were criminals the moment they got the call, and every action they took was to confirm that preconceived notion. When combined with Karen Vickers' deposition, in which, under pressure from her own company's lawyers, she admitted to having a bad feeling about the Williamses and ignoring the actual thief because she was flustered, the case was airtight. It was no longer about a simple mistake. It was a clear, documented conspiracy to frame an innocent couple, born from the ugliest corners of prejudice. The truth, in all its devastating detail, was now fully exposed. The fallout was not just swift, it was brutal. The gears of justice, once kick-started by Captain Marcus Williams, began to grind with relentless efficiency, and the karmic blowback for the three individuals responsible was devastating. For Officer Chad Miller, his career in law enforcement was over before it had barely begun. The internal affairs investigation, bolstered by the body cam footage and Marcus's formal complaint, was a slam dunk. The Oak Creek Police Department fired him for gross misconduct, violations of protocol, and conduct unbecoming an officer. But it didn't end there. The county district attorney, facing immense public pressure and a rock-solid case presented by the Williams family's attorney, pressed criminal charges. Chad Miller was charged with 2 counts of filing a false police report, 2 counts of unlawful restraint, and, most seriously, a federal charge for deprivation of civil rights under color of law. 6 months later, he pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, and was stripped of his ability to ever work in law enforcement again. His smug smirk in the parking lot was replaced by a hollow, defeated look in his mugshot. For Sergeant Frank Davis, his was a quieter but in many ways more tragic downfall. He wasn't the aggressive instigator, but his complicity was his undoing. The investigation found that as the senior officer on scene, he had a duty to de-escalate, to ensure proper procedure was followed, and to correct his subordinates' flagrant violations. He did none of those things. He stood by, allowed it to happen, and in doing so, endorsed it. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty and neglect of a subordinate. He was forced into retirement, but the police pension board, citing the criminal nature of the incident, voted to strip him of his pension. After 31 years on the force, Frank Davis left with nothing. He lost his home to foreclosure within a year and was last seen working as a night watchman for a storage facility, a ghost of the authority figure he once was. For Karen Vickers and Quantum Electronics, the corporate hammer came down hard. The moment the security footage was verified, Quantum Electronics' corporate office went into full damage control. Karen Vickers was fired immediately. In a press release, the company called her actions a reprehensible and unacceptable violation of our company's core values of respect and integrity. But the corporation itself could not escape liability. Faced with an ironclad, multi-million-dollar lawsuit from the Williams family for defamation, false imprisonment, and emotional distress, Quantum Electronics' legal team quickly sought a settlement. The final number was never made public, but sources close to the case reported it to be in the range of $2.5 million. A condition of the settlement was a public written apology to the Williams family published in the state's largest newspaper. Furthermore, the company was forced to overhaul its employee training programs nationwide, implementing mandatory, rigorous anti-bias and de-escalation training for all managers. The Oak Creek store location became a pariah in the community. Sales plummeted, and within a year, the gleaming glass building was vacant, a silent monument to the day prejudice and lies were met with unyielding truth. For the Williams family, their vindication was absolute, but they did not simply take the settlement money and retreat into a quiet life. Guided by Eleanor's quiet strength and Arthur's deep sense of history and justice, they used a significant portion of the funds to establish the Leo Williams Foundation for Justice, named after the grandson whose birthday gift started it all. The foundation provides pro bono legal aid to victims of racial profiling and false arrest, turning their traumatic experience into a powerful force for good in their community. Arthur and Eleanor became reluctant but respected public figures, speaking at community events about their experience, not with bitterness, but with a message of vigilance, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what is right. They had been targeted because their attackers saw them as weak, as easy victims. In the end, their quiet dignity proved to be the most powerful weapon of all. The camera they bought for Leo sat on a shelf in their living room, not as a reminder of that awful day, but as a symbol of how an act of love, when defended with courage, could triumph over an act of hate. 6 months had passed. The Earth had completed half a journey around the sun, tilting Oak Creek away from the fierce heat of summer and back into the familiar, gentle embrace of autumn. It was the same crisp, clean air that had filled Arthur Williams's lungs with nostalgia on that fateful Tuesday, but now it carried a different quality. The scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves no longer felt like an ending, a retreat into the quiet dormancy of winter, but like a cleansing. It was the smell of a chapter closed and a new one, hard-earned and deeply cherished, beginning. The town itself seemed to breathe this new air. The story of what happened in the quantum electronics parking lot had seeped into the local consciousness, becoming a modern-day fable, a cautionary tale whispered in grocery store aisles and debated over coffee at the town diner. The gleaming glass-walled building that once housed the electronics store now stood as a silent, hollow monument to the day a community's ugliest prejudices were laid bare. Its dark, empty windows reflected the passing clouds and the changing colors of the oak trees, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the high cost of a lie. Locals called it the Williams Incident, a phrase that carried a complex weight of shame, respect, and a nascent, town-wide resolve to be better. This resolve was most visible within the Oak Creek Police Department. The scandal had been a brutal but necessary cauterization of a festering wound. Lieutenant Allen, now promoted to captain and given a clear mandate by a chastened city council, was leading a top-down reformation. The old guard's cynical, coasting culture was being systematically dismantled. New, rigorous, and continuous anti-bias training, designed in consultation with civil rights groups, was mandatory for every officer. A community outreach division was established, tasked with rebuilding the shattered trust between the department and the citizens it served. Captain Allen, a man whose weary professionalism had been galvanized into a crusader's purpose, often used an anonymized version of the Williamses' arrest and training seminars, his voice steel hard as he described it as the absolute embodiment of a catastrophic failure, a never-again moment for his department. Today, however, the epicenter of that earthquake was an oasis of peace and celebration. At the Williamses' comfortable, book-lined home, the air was filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the warm, inviting sense of cinnamon, baking apples, and Arthur's famous slow-cooked barbecue. The backyard, a meticulously kept square of green lawn and vibrant marigolds, was alive with the cheerful noise of friends and family. They were celebrating a dual milestone, Arthur's 75th birthday and the official launch of the Leo Williams Foundation for Justice. Arthur stood by the large smoker, a content smile playing on his lips. His old tweed jacket, the one that had become an unwitting symbol of his public humiliation, was retired. In its place, he wore a handsome charcoal gray blazer, a birthday gift from Marcus. He wasn't just the patriarch of his family today. He was the chairman of the board of a new, powerful force for good. He turned a rack of ribs with a practiced hand, his gaze sweeping across the yard, cataloging the faces of their supporters. His old principal was there, locked in a lively debate with members of their church deacon board. Their civil rights attorney, a sharp, empathetic man named David Chen, was laughing with his wife and kids near the patio. And standing near the bird bath, looking slightly overwhelmed but deeply happy, was Ben, the young sales associate from Quantum. After the store closed, Arthur had personally written him a letter of recommendation that had landed him a better job with a local, family-owned camera shop. Ben was an honored guest, a living symbol of the simple decency that had been the first casualty on that terrible afternoon. Eleanor came up behind Arthur, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. Her silver-streaked hair caught the golden afternoon light. "They all came, Artie," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. Arthur placed his hand over hers. "They came because what we're doing matters, Elle. They came because they know it could have been them." He looked at her, his eyes full of a love that 51 years had only deepened. "How are you holding up?" "I'm better than holding up," she said, her voice firm with the librarian's quiet strength that Marcus had inherited. "I feel purposeful." In the weeks after the incident, Eleanor had been the family's emotional bedrock. While Arthur wrestled with the historical echoes of the injustice and Marcus channeled his anger into strategic action, Eleanor focused on the human cost. She had spent hours on the phone, not with lawyers, but with other families in the state who had reached out after hearing their story. Families who had endured similar humiliations without the resources or the Marine captain's son to fight back. It was her quiet insistence that their settlement should not be a private comfort, but a public weapon. The foundation was her vision as much as anyone's. Across the lawn, Marcus watched them, leaning against the sturdy oak tree he'd fallen out of as a boy. He was on a planned leave this time, the surprise replaced by a profound sense of rightness. He held a simple mug of coffee, its warmth a small comfort against the autumn chill. He saw the genuine peace on his parents' faces, a peace he had fought to restore. The fight had been ugly, exhausting, and had stirred a rage in him that felt dangerously primal. It was one thing to face a declared enemy on a foreign battlefield. It was another thing entirely to face an insidious, smiling prejudice at home, aimed at the two people who constituted his entire world. This battle hadn't been won with a rifle or a tactical plan, but with cellular data, video footage, and the unbending steel of his resolve. He had learned that a Freedom of Information Act request, wielded correctly, could be as powerful as an airstrike. His father caught his eye and beckoned him over. "Captain," Arthur said, his voice brimming with pride, "come settle a debate for your old man. My principal here thinks the turning point was the security footage. I maintain it was when you showed them your military ID." Marcus smiled and shook the principal's hand. "Respectfully, sir, you're both wrong," he said, his gaze shifting to his father. "The turning point was when you and Mom decided 51 years ago to build a life based on integrity. It was when you taught me that our name, our character, was the only thing no one could ever take from us. Everything else was just a tactic to defend that truth." Arthur's eyes welled slightly. He clapped his son on the shoulder, a wordless gesture of overwhelming love and gratitude. The center of the party's gravity, however, was not the celebrated elders or the decorated son. It was a 12-year-old boy with a shock of black hair and a look of intense concentration on his face. Leo, the budding filmmaker, the unwitting catalyst for this entire saga, was in his element. He moved through the crowd with the Canon EOS R100, the camera now feeling like a natural extension of his arm. It was no longer just a birthday gift. It was a legacy, a tool, a responsibility. He wasn't just passively recording the event. He was creating a document. He was conducting short, earnest interviews, his voice barely audible over the party's hubbub. He pulled his great-aunt aside and asked her to tell the story of when his grandfather stood up to a segregated bus driver in 1968. He cornered Ben and asked him, "What did you think when you first saw my grandparents?" Ben, flustered but charmed, answered honestly, I thought they looked like they were very much in love and really excited to buy a present for their grandkid. Later, Leo approached Marcus, who was now sitting on the porch steps. Uncle Marcus, he began, framing the shot carefully. Can you tell me, were you scared that day? Marcus looked at his nephew, truly seeing him for the first time not as a child, but as the future storyteller of their family. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Scared isn't the right word, Leo, he said slowly. In combat, you feel fear because things are chaotic and unpredictable. When I saw what was happening to Grandma and Grandpa, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. I saw a wrong that had to be righted. I had a clear objective, and I will never, ever be scared of doing what's right for our family. Leo nodded, absorbing the answer. He held the shot for a moment longer, then whispered, Thank you, before moving on, his mind already editing the scene. As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, the party began to wind down. Eleanor insisted everyone gather on the large, screened-in porch. A projector screen had been set up, and Leo, with a nervous pride, announced he had something to show them. He clicked a button on his laptop, and the screen flickered to life. It was the film he had been shooting all day, but it was so much more than a simple home movie. It was a beautiful, poignant montage, skillfully edited to a gentle piano score. He had woven in shots of the party, of people laughing, eating, and embracing, with scanned images from old family albums. There was Arthur in his dusty classroom, a younger Eleanor surrounded by stacks of books in her library, their wedding photo from 1974, a picture of a tiny Marcus taking his first steps. He intercut these with his new interview footage, Ben's earnest face, his great-aunt's knowing smile, his uncle's resolute gaze. The film told a story not of trauma, but of character. It was a visual argument, presenting incontrovertible evidence of a life well lived, of a family built on love, faith, and quiet dignity. The final sequence was a slow, deliberate zoom into a shot Leo had taken earlier in the day. It was Arthur and Eleanor standing by the now empty grill, her arms around his waist, his hand covering hers. They were looking directly at their grandson behind the camera, and their faces were alight with a love that was both deeply personal and universally understood. As the image faded to black, a simple title appeared on the screen, The Williamses. A reverent silence held the porch for a moment, thick with emotion. Quiet sniffles could be heard from the back row. David Chen, the attorney who had seen the ugliest side of the case, reached over and squeezed Arthur's shoulder. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her face a perfect portrait of pride and love. It's wonderful, Leo, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Arthur, his voice thick and gravelly, looked at his grandson, who was trying to hide a huge grin. It's a masterpiece, son, he declared. Then he corrected himself, his history teacher's mind making the crucial connection. No, it's more than that. It's a primary source document. You captured the truth, and the truth we learned is the only thing that matters. As Leo looked at the image of his grandparents frozen in his memory and now on the screen, he finally understood the full weight of the gift in his hands. The camera wasn't just for making up stories. It was for telling the true ones. It was for capturing the evidence of a person's soul, for documenting the character that no false accusation could ever truly tarnish. The truth of his family, he knew with the sudden, profound certainty of a 12-year-old who had witnessed a quiet miracle, was the most powerful story he would ever tell. They had faced down the ugly, the ignorant, and the unjust, and they had won, not by sinking to that level, but by rising above it, armed with a librarian's quiet strength, a historian's long perspective, and the fierce, unyielding, and clarifying love of a United States Marine captain coming home to defend his own. The scar from that day remained, but it was no longer a source of pain. It was a mark of victory. This wasn't just a story about a stolen camera or a mistaken identity. It was a story about the deep, ugly roots of prejudice and the incredible power of dignity in the face of humiliation. Arthur and Eleanor Williams were targeted because someone saw them as a stereotype, not as human beings. But the haters, the accusers, and the corrupt officers all made one fatal miscalculation. They never imagined the strength of the family they were trying to tear down. They never counted on Captain Marcus Williams. The hard karma that came for those responsible wasn't magic. It was the direct result of a son who refused to let his parents' honor be trampled. If their story of courage and vindication moved you, and if you believe that justice should always prevail, then please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.